Добрый день, друзья. Поговорим о воображении. Одна из важнейших составляющих.
Hello, dear friends. Let's discuss imagination. It's very important for the success of a person. So it's very important, and it opens the new opportunities for us. We can rethink the science and business and to find new points of the growth. What is imagination from the point of view of the science? What is the difference between the collective and individual imagination, and how does it influence the capitalization and viability of the company? So we'll discuss it with our speakers. So the moderator is Martin Reeves, the managing director and the chief partner, BCG, the chairman of the Institute of Bruce Henderson, and our speakers, Alexander Kuleshov, rector of Skolkov Institute of Science and Technologies, Andrei Krichevsky, president of Association IP Chain, vice president and the chairman of the committee on the intellectual property and creative industries, and Leonid Zhukov, general director of the Scientific Research Institute of Artificial Intelligence. So, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, I think, what's going to be a very interesting session. We're going to ask some very simple questions about something which is quite hard to understand, which is imagination. This conference is about innovation, but of course, innovation, the things we do to create new things, begins with innovations in the mind or imagination. So the way that this is going to work is that I've actually just written a book which launches in Russia tomorrow on the topic of imagination. So I'm going to provide a provocation, and then we're going to hear from our eminent guests what their view of imagination is. And it should be interesting because we've got a very senior scientist, we've got a very knowledgeable person that runs an AI group, and we've got an expert in IP. So it'll be interesting to see what we make of this topic. So let me begin with my provocation. So, in my view, imagination is a basic human trait. It's a defining trait of our species. A 5-year-old can imagine things which are not the case, but which could be the case. And every great company begins with an active imagination. So imagination is all around us. But really, we rarely speak about imagination in business. And with the CEOs that I deal with, they all complain that their companies are not imaginative enough, that the larger they get, the harder it is to harness imagination. So what's the problem exactly? Well, one problem, I think, is the industrial heritage. Namely, I think Henry Ford actually said, the last thing we want is for the assembly line worker to think, to use their imagination. But of course, now we require people to bring their full humanity to work. The second idea is that we may legitimately look to small companies for imagination, to imagine new things, and we may be happy for large companies to simply exploit those inventions of small companies. And 30 years ago, that was a reality. But it depends upon one assumption, which is that the success of the large company can continue for a long time. But I'm basically a strategist by profession, a business strategist. And one of the things that we know about competitive advantage is that it decays, it disappears about 10 times faster than it did 30 years ago. What does that mean? That means that every company, even large companies, now need to reimagine themselves. A third problem is that we may have the image that it's impossible to harness imagination because we may have an image that imagination is some sort of magical act that comes to special people in special moments. But if you think about it, this is rather strange because businesses are not afraid to attack and try to harness other complex aspects of humanity, such as, for instance, consumer psychology. We don't imagine that you could never understand consumer psychology. Neither do we say we could never understand team motivation and team structure. So actually, I believe that imagination can be harnessed and needs to be harnessed. So I'm just going to show you two charts very quickly. So the chart on the left here shows you the fade rate of the fade of competitive advantage. So in 1990, if you were a leader in 1 year, probably there's a 95% probability that you would be a leader in your industry in the following year. Now, it's quite the other way around. 95% of your advantage will likely disappear in 1 year in this very fast-moving technological world. So the next slide, please. So let me give you the essence of my point of view that I'm sure my fellow panelists will have an opinion on, which is, I think to harness imagination requires getting 6 things right. And we can use some very concrete practices to get those 6 things right. So we know from the neuroscience of imagination that it begins with surprise. We update our mental models because we see something that doesn't fit our mental model. And I call this the seduction. And it requires, for example, that large companies are externally oriented. They are looking for surprise rather than looking inside their own corporations and looking only at averages. The second step, having been surprised, having been motivated to update one's mental model, is to work the idea. Now, I'm not sure about the education system in Russia, but personally, I have not been trained in counterfactual thinking since kindergarten. I was not trained at business school, I was not trained at university in counterfactual thinking, but there is a discipline of counterfactual thinking. We can develop an idea by, for instance, dividing it into its components and then recombining those components. Or we can apply a constraint in order to force new thinking. The third step is colliding the idea with reality. So we may have been seduced by the anomaly in reality. We may have thought about the ideas in our minds, but then we need to collide the idea with reality, not only to validate the idea, as in experimentation, but also to generate further surprises, to generate further inspiration. Then the fourth step is having ideas spread. And if you think about the divisional structure of most large companies, they're almost designed to prevent the spread of ideas, which is unfortunate because philosophers talk about the intersubjectivity problem, which means for something as intangible as an idea, how do I know that you're thinking the same thing that I'm thinking? We actually need a very conducive environment in order for ideas to spread. And as part of the book, I studied companies that focus their HR systems on facilitating the spread of ideas. They have entrepreneurial heroes who they celebrate. They construct narratives which make the idea appeal to people. They're very careful about how they name and describe ideas. They have a cultures of patience and listening because early stage ideas are generally very fragile and so on. The fifth stage is, it may sound like the opposite of imagination, but in order to harness an idea, you have to be able to replicate its success. Imagine that you were the Four Seasons hotel chain and you were trying to replicate great customer service in China with new employees and new customers. How would you do that? Because if you told people everything that you do in New York or Moscow, it would be overwhelming. And if you told people just use your instincts, it would be too vague. So how do you create a script which captures the essence of success? How do you industrialize and communicate the idea? Because the success of an idea is rather paradoxical. The success of an idea depends upon it becoming pervasive and even boring. So pervasive that we take it for granted to construct the new ordinary. And then, having reached this stage of being successful with industrializing our ideas, we know that in business there's a very well-established phenomenon called the success trap, which is we become complacent. We imagine that our competitors are not very smart. We imagine we're the best. We admire the size of our achievements, and we become complacent. And complacency is not conducive to reimagining companies. So we must stay humble, and we must self-disrupt. We must imagine, even though conditions are quite comfortable. So that's my idea and my provocation. But perhaps I can turn to our panelists and ask them what they think. So Leonid, maybe I can begin with you. Unbiased by anything that I've said, what is imagination in your role of line of business? Because I believe you run a big AI group at a bank.
Thanks. So can you guys hear me? Okay, there. Well, so first of all,
Итак, в
thank you for
первую
the
очередь,
introduction. And really,
So-
imagination, is a way of creating a mental picture of something that doesn't exist so far. And there are two things. Like I run an institute which is working on AI. And so for us, for the team, it's really about imagining the future. It's really about creating something that hasn't existed before. Interestingly enough, I was listening to your sort of provocation part, and I realized that today AI is capable of decomposing things and reassembling back together. And so if we just restrict our understanding of imagination as a notion of, okay, let's create something new from something that previously existed, but just putting it in a slightly different way, AI is perfectly capable of doing it. But if what you had there is that there is an important part, is an element of surprise. Right? Creating something that is not expected in current settings. So that's what AI is not capable of doing yet. And so in this sense, AI does not possess imagination. And that's where, us humans have to jump in and work on it.
Thanks very much, Leonid. Andrei, maybe I can ask you, there's a sort of assumption in what I said, which is that imagination is a purely human domain that AI cannot imitate or replicate. Would you agree with that?
For sure. Of course, imagination is purely human. Because the reason for this is the one that Leonid has already said. Because AI can разобрать на части. They can decompose and build it back. But in the beginning of the 12th century in Germany, which was the most IP-developed country, they claimed that if they faced a new idea, they asked whether it's a new construction or it's a new principle. So the construction, if the construction is changed, it doesn't let you to have a new patent in that times, and actually for today also. If the principle is changed, so it's a new invention or a new creation or imagination.
So let's come back to that idea in a while, but let me bring in Alexander Kuleshov. You probably have observed for many years the role of imagination in science and business. How would you define imagination, and why do you think that large organizations have trouble imagining? Alexander?
Да, спасибо. Но я, конечно, так не думаю, на
So
самом деле.
thank you. No, I don't think like
Мне
this,
кажется,
and I
что
think
мы,
that
может быть, даже говорим немножко не о том.
maybe we speak
Вы
about
знаете,
different
вот есть такая
things.
замечательная история.
So there is a great
Великий
story.
немецкий математик
So a
Гильберт,
great
мы до
German
сих пор решаем
mathematician,
проблемы,
Gilbert,
сформулированные
was
в
still trying to
1900
solve the
году.
problems that were
Дэвид
formulated
Гильберт
in 90s.
однажды был спрошен
So he was
своим
asked
приятелем:
once by his
слушай, а где
friend,
твой ученик Н?
where
Что
is
с
your
ним стало?
student Ant? What
Он, знаешь, он
happened to
стал
him?
поэтом.
And you
Для
know,
математика у него
he became
недостаточно
a poet
воображения.
because he does not have enough
Вообще говоря,
imagination
воображение,
for a
на мой взгляд, это
mathematician.
способность конструировать некоторые
So I
новые
think
миры.
that it's
Понимаете,
an opportunity to construct new
сериал «Игра
worlds.
престолов», я думаю,
For
что
example,
многие
the
его смотрели,
Games of
я, в
Thrones,
частности,
many
смотрел, точно
people
смотрел, с
watched
удовольствием.
this series. I watched it with great
это
pleasure
действительно
because this is
настоящее
really
воображение,
imagination. So this is really games of imagination. So it's a possibility to construct your own world. It's the same regarding Harry Potter. It's some constructed world. What's the difference between this construction for a writer and for a scientist? The writer is not limited with anything, and the scientists should also construct their own worlds, but the scientists are limited by the factors that exist. So the practice shows that it can be a difference. So, for example, humanity for several thousands of times lived in the world of Aristotle, and who thought that hard objects fell down faster than light objects. Then there was the theory of world ether that was logically very nice. It was not contradictory, however, it has no connection with life. So that's why scientists, they create their own world. However, unfortunately or fortunately, the scientists should, when they create their own world, they should take into consideration different factors, experimental factors that are some basic limitations for him. So they just cannot forget about the factors. So Einstein said a very interesting phrase. He said that imagination is more important than the knowledge because our knowledge is limited and our imagination is limitless. So I think this is really true. So regarding the business and regarding the imagination and business, I think it's something different, though the borders can be maybe not so evident. So for me, imagination and business is the ability to see something that you are used to from another point of view, to find some unusual potential capabilities, something that everyone is missing, that no one thinks that it's something that is worth of attention. So there is a short story, for example, that was taken from my personal practice. In 2015, I read a lecture at some conference for young people, and at night my resident showed me the pictures. He learned how you can take your picture and then with some neural networks you can turn it into the picture of Modigliani, for example, or Picasso. Everyone laughed, of course, and it was very interesting, funny. And then a year and a half, the company Prisma appeared, and it started a big business with this idea. So what I wanted to say that there were dozens of people who heard about it, but no, they didn't think that it's interesting. Then there was another person who saw this problem in a new light, and he saw that there is a potential business in this idea. So the possibility to see the money where no one can find it. It's also imagination. Maybe it's not directly connected with the imagination, with the construction of new world. That is always the basis of serious science. So this is the imagination. I maybe would formulate it a little bit differently. So this is the ability to see different things in another light. I think I speak too much. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much. You set up an interesting theme there, which I also want to pursue today, which is the connection between artificial intelligence and imagination. So Kai-Fu Lee and Martin Ford, the AI commentators, are of the view that routine so-called correlative thinking and tasks in business will be taken over quite quickly in the coming decade by AI. And the implication of that, in their view, is that the humans in companies need to focus on more uniquely human cognitive activities, and they would both list at least three. One of them would be empathy, dealing with other humans. Another one would be counterfactual thinking or imagination, which is thinking about things for which there is no training data because they don't exist. And also issues of ethics, which is what should we do? What is it right to do? Would you agree with that view, Leonid, as an AI scientist? Do you think that we'll ever have artificial imagination?
Let me start with ethics, right? So at the moment, ethics, which is established by humans, by us, so AI does not understand what ethics is by itself, and so clearly that's still in the human hands to make a judgment if something that AI is doing is ethical or not, and how to apply it. Regarding the artificial imagination, there are a lot of ways we're trying to approach this, right? And as I mentioned before, if we just think about AI as being able to, take what's existing right now and sort of recompose it differently, Well, that's sort of part of imagination. But at the same time, like we mentioned artists. If you think about capabilities of AI, for example, take your photograph, take a picture, take a classical portrait, and repaint it using impressionism style. Yes, it can do it, and you can think about this as a sort of as a imagination. But I doubt, and actually I'm absolutely sure that AI is not capable to, for example, come up with ideas that cubists were using. So then, like you said, the principle of showing an object at the same time from, for example, different angles, this entirely new principle, that AI is not capable of doing, and I'm not even sure if it ever be able to do that.
Would you agree perhaps with a weaker principle that AI can support human imaginative activities in some ways?
Absolutely. I think that's, again, sort of, today we're talking a lot about sort of arts, and I mean, there is a good reason for that, right? So, I mean, if we think about imagination, we think about artists, composers, right, filmmakers. So I think AI provides a new technique that actually can unleash a lot of creativity. The same way, say, Impressionism started when there was enough right technology, which means at that time where the paint it was possible to buy ready mixed paint in the tubes, so they can paint plein air, right? And so that pretty much unleashed the changes and unleashed the new Impressionism, right? The new way to paint. And the same way with AI. It's very much possible that it's as a tool, as an instrument, will unleash a lot of creativity in a lot of ways to create new forms of art. And then we can think about it, yes, the AI has some imagination.
Andrew, you and I were chatting before this the session about whether it's even the right question, because to separate the algorithm from the humans that created it, or the humans that interpret it, or the humans that find the results useful or not, may be an artificial construct. In the combination of an algorithm and a human, where is the imagination?
Можно я все-таки продолжу на русском?
If you don't mind, I would like to continue in Russian. So the point is that here, right now, we have quite a complicated combination, and all the speakers have already formed that. What was mentioned by the head of Skoltech. Well, in fact, it's very important to say that imagination, it is something that was referred to as the method of universe, virtual worlds. You can call it anyhow you like. This is what imagination is all about. This is certain creativity, but it doesn't have an ultimate goal or vector, so it just exists within a certain reality. In fact, neurobiologists call this kind of activity of our brain, they say it's about creating abstract models, and we all have such an abstract model of this building, for example. Every person we see here, and for example, I don't know, English-speaking audience somehow forgot a little bit my English, so it's one thing. But there is another thing also, something that is applicable. And Martin, what he said, he asked how it can be used in business, how can we use AI in order to harness imagination. But apparently here we have a vector, and here it's not just about imagination, it's more about creativity. That is the point. And from this point of view, it's very important to feel this line, this difference. As for imagination itself, AI, well, it could help, of course, but it could be like a source of inspiration, but that is it. As for creativity, AI is a great instrument, and this is something that has already helped a lot. It's helping now, and it allows us to separate different information flows in order to have this imagination vector and to act further on. Well, we talk about ideas and creativity. After that, well, according to Peter of Erger-Meyer, we also should make reference to them. There we have those schemes, and here AI is quite applicable. I'm sorry for being not that brief, but still.
Thank you. Alexander, could I come back to you, Mr. Kuleshov, and ask you about the role of education here? So let's take, for example, sustainability technologies, sustainable technologies, carbon capture technologies, and so on. We need to think about possibilities that don't currently exist. And I posit that in some ways this is to do with how we're educated, and different nations stress, deductive thinking or abductive thinking or imaginative thinking. How do we educate for the imagination we need to find new framings and new applications?
Well, as for imagination, it's a particular talent that is given to every person, and it is there in every person's genes. On the other hand, if you teach a boy, for example, to play football, but not everyone can become Lionel Messi or Pele. It's also the case here. So by nature, we are given a certain portion, potential portion of imagination. That is the point. We have just what Andrei Kulchevsky has just mentioned. He talked about creativity. He talked about ability to observe objects. Well, I would say that's not the same things as for these things. They are not the same. For example, we have genius composer. Let's talk about Beethoven. So he lived in the world of sounds. He created new sounds, and I don't know that it's directly linked to imagination. Of course, imagination is linked to creativity, to a certain talent we are given. But imagination, that is a bit different things. I would like to repeat my formula. From my perspective, imagination is about ability to create a new worlds in our own brain, create these worlds, and it can happen in different aspects. It could be, for example, a poem, something scientific, and so on and so forth. For example, Newton in 1915 talked about a gravitational wave, and only 100 years ago, sorry, what I'm talking about, no. Only 100 years later, gravitation waves were confirmed by experiments. But in his hand, he created the system where gravitational gravity waves existed. That was his world, a new world that he constructed in his head. That's what imagination is all about. As for imagination in a business, in fact, well, it could help, but at the same time, it could work as a barrier. I think that one of good examples, Steve Jobs. He, on one hand, he was a very creative person. On the other hand, he limited his imagination. He could do that, and as we all know, he used to say, "You shouldn't do anything for with kind of thing. You couldn't see some kind of an end user, so you kind of narrow your imagination. So you don't want to go beyond limits of certain needs of a particular user. Of course, this is also a talent, but a talent of a different nature. It is hardly can be compared with each other."
So we just have time for one more question, and I'd like to ask a question about the implied project of this conference. So if you look at the things the organizers have been saying, essentially, they've been talking about uncovering new technologies. They've been talking about seeing new possibilities in science. They've been talking about developing those technologies with respect to quality of life, sustainability, and other utilities. And generally, if one puts together such a technological development project, clearly we think about the technology, we think about the funding, we think about the project management, we think about the science. Is there a role in the leadership of this technology project implied by this conference for imagination? Where do we inject imagination into the project plan to catapult Russia into the next technological age with the things we've been talking about this conference? So assume that you're the director of this grand project, Leonid. How would you inject imagination into the whole project?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. So first of all, I would say sometimes the leader has this imagination, has the idea, has a vision, sometimes they do not, right? And that probably will determine the success and the failure of the project. But then the question of an execution within the large project, right? So what we do, for example, right now with our institute, we actually created it as a combination of independent group of scientists. Each group is headed by a guy who has an imagination and who has an idea he wants to execute on.
This, the appointment of the people is one of the most critical steps.
Oh, absolutely. So you need to choose, yes, you need to choose the right people. Exactly. And let them run with it.
I'm asking the same question in a slightly different way. So, Mr. Khrushchev talked about the gravity and then the gravity wave, the reconception. In some sense, this technology project we're talking about here in Skolkovo, let's supposing that the aim is to accelerate that next wave, to accelerate the arrival of the gravitational wave or its equivalent. What acts of leadership could we do to accelerate that next reframing?
So I think this is a more question for those who are responsible for acceleration. It has always been a complicated question for me how it happens so that you can actually accelerate a project you don't really know, or you don't know in every single detail. So I think that my basic answer would be imagination and creativity. They should be some kind of an injection or a permanent background at every single project stage, regardless of whether we are in the process of acceleration or we have just launched the project. So here is a delicate point, and it was mentioned by Mr. Kuleshov. It's very important to harness. So this injection of creativity, it should be really kind of constrained, or it should be controlled. I would say that this is a particular thing or story that could take you to some very, very remote corners of the universe, just distracting you from business.
Thank you. So, Mr. Kuleshov, let me come back to you and your example. You gave a very good example of Newtonian gravity and then the reframing and the realization of gravitational waves 100 years later, or more than 100 years later. Supposing that the Skolkovo project, we make an analogy to that process and we say the aim is to accelerate the progress that we want to make, to put in place the right conditions as leadership for the rapid progress of the technology project. So Leonid said, deploy the right people was his answer. What would your answer be as an act of leadership that would accelerate process on such a project?
So it's very important to find talented people. This is the main task of the leader. There is in mathematics, for example, such a folklore is called the formula of Ключевер. Leader of level n chooses subordinates n minus 2, well, whatever. So this is just a formula about Ключевер, a very famous mathematician, but I'm not talking about his success or his talent and math. So, but it's called a formula of Ключевер. Well, I think that you understood what I was talking about. So, leader of N should pick subordinates or subordinates of level -2. So, coming back to the function of a leader, I think here we have some constant indicators or figures, and success is not possible with that. So, you should be able to select the right people.
Right. But unfortunately,
Of course, we need to just not listen to these people, but also hear them, see them. You wanted to say something?
no, I thought you finished. My apologies. Yes, well that...
Ну, хорошо, я закончил.
Actually, okay, I finished that. Well, anyway, I can start at any point and finish at any point. I can talk for a long time.
Listening, actually, in my research on imagination, leaders often talk about the fragility of early stage ideas and the importance of a listening and empathetic environment, because ideas are not born fully formed or with a perfect financial case. So I think that's a very interesting point. So unfortunately, given the complexity of the topic, we are out of time. We could carry on for many hours, but this has been fascinating. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I want to thank my panelists for a very interesting discussion and I think a very important topic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Leonid.